my mom said, in Columbia County we have to do this thing called a senior project, which is this thing that goes through the whole year, and we come up with a topic for a research paper, and then we make a product off of the research paper, or just the general career that you picked. And I picked apologetics, which is the act of defending your faith through like argumentative ways. And I wrote a research paper on proving the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And while I was writing it, it got me thinking that, like me, before I wrote the research paper, I just assumed that everyone believed in the resurrection, and they were just like, oh, okay, the resurrection exists, and I just didn't think anything of it and just went about my day. But I read a study by the American Culture and Faith Institute that only 4% of the population of our generation, which is millennials, have a Christian worldview. And to put that in perspective, if one of you were with a group of 20 of your friends, 4% is only you would be Christian. Wow. So that means we're in the minority in a world that's out to get us and try to bring us down. And so I thought it would be good for you guys to hear some of the questions and arguments that people might bring up that you might encounter in your life, because just by a show of hands, most of you have encountered somebody who's not a Christian, right? Or asked questions to you about not being a Christian. Yeah. And so I figured the resurrection's a very hot topic for debate, and I thought I'd give you 8 arguments that non-Christians would give that the resurrection didn't exist. And before I actually give you the arguments, all of you have heard the Easter story, right? Is nobody's not heard it, right? Okay, good. So, in order for the resurrection to happen, Jesus has to die on be crucified. And some people would argue that Jesus didn't exist. Well, Jesus did exist, because just besides the biblical documentation of Jesus in the Bible, there are also documentations of Jesus from people that weren't associated with Christianity, such as Roman scholars and historians throughout that time period, such as Josephus, Lucian, Bara, Mars, Serapion, and Talmud. And all of these people were not associated with Christianity, which means that they had no reason to write about some dude that didn't exist. And they didn't even believe in Christianity. They believed in Roman mythology, which is like the planets Venus, Saturn, and Mercury are all named after Roman gods. And they believed in like this multiple god system where like every aspect of their life was controlled by a different god. And they really had no reason to believe, or for that matter, document dude that these Jews, this minority group in Rome, the Roman Empire, that this dude was just walking around and he didn't actually exist. So it logically makes sense that Jesus had to exist. And that's number one. Number two, Jesus didn't die. Now, way back when, in the biblical times, when killing people was a pastime, the Romans were like, they cornered the market on ways to kill people. They were very good at it. They had beheadings, they drowned people, they burned them at the stake, they hanged them, they did gladiator fights, they did crucifixions. They just did all this brutal stuff to people. And one of their most common ones for lower class citizens and thieves and like slaves, as I just mentioned, was crucifixion. And on the Jesus being crucified, there's a theory that's been going around called the swoon theory, which states that Jesus didn't actually die. He simply was unconscious on the cross and they thought he was dead and he was revived later on. And that theory is absolutely ridiculous, because the way they crucified people was they hung you on the cross, they put a nail in between your 2 feet and one in each hand. So in order to breathe, you had to push yourself up on your legs in order to get a clear passage to your lungs. And that got very hard once you were in like 2 hours into this thing, and if they got tired of it, they just break your legs and you would suffocate. Now, Jesus in particular definitely died. I found a very credible source for this, discrediting the swoon theory, called the National Medical Association. They wrote an article on the medical point of view of Jesus' crucifixion, and they stated that Jesus suffocated on the cross, and basically his lungs filled with blood after a certain amount of time, and he suffocated to death on that cross. And on top of that, when they poked Jesus' side, blood and water came out separately, which is a definite sign that you're actually dead. So the swoon theory has absolutely no bearing on Jesus or his crucifixion. So number 1, Jesus didn't exist. Number 2, Jesus didn't die. And number 3 is now moving on to the resurrection itself, where some people claim that the disciples moved the body after Jesus had died. Well, the Romans, when they crucified Jesus, they threw him in a tomb, rolled a big giant rock in front of it, and put Roman guards in front of it, stationed at all times. And back then, if a Roman guard failed to do their duty, the penalty was death. So I really doubt that the disciples actually moved this rock and moved the body and faked it this whole time. It's very, very unlikely. And another theory is that Jesus was dead the whole time, and they just faked it all. Well, why would people fake Jesus' resurrection if they had to go through all of these hardships and persecution and being martyred and killed for a lie? It just doesn't make any sense. And especially when the disciples were, right after Jesus died, the disciples were very scared. They cowered in a room pretty much and just shut the door, and that was it. They were just going to stay there until they were going to be killed by the Pharisees. However, once they heard news that Jesus had resurrected, they had this drastic change in their attitude, meaning that they went from scared to death to proclaiming Jesus is alive and spreading his word in the streets, which doesn't make any sense if Jesus was dead the whole time. And if you did that and it was a lie and people found out, all of you would die for nothing. And when Jesus was resurrected, he appeared to a ton of people over a 40-day period. And some people think that they hallucinated this whole thing, and that clearly does not make any sense, because even with today's technology, it would be impossible to make everybody in different locations around Judea and within a 40-day period hallucinate the exact same thing at the exact same time. It wasn't possible then, and it's not possible now. And segueing back to Jesus' tomb itself, the people who saw the tomb empty were very crucial to the resurrection's validity, and the eyewitness accounts of that are recorded in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they're quite unique because the people who were recorded in The Gospels were women. And that doesn't seem like a big thing now because everyone is seen as equal, and gender roles in laws and jobs aren't as strict as they were way back in biblical times. In biblical times, women were seen as second-class citizens. They were barely above slaves. They didn't do anything. They weren't allowed to attend public events, and they weren't even counted in many cases in the Bible, such as the feeding the 5,000, where the number 5,000 is simply the number of men that were in the valley where Jesus taught. If you included women and children, that's probably about 10 to 15,000 people there. And in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and the birth of Jesus, the Christmas story, Luke mentions a census that was taken by a Roman governor. And back then, when they did these censuses, they only included the men. So they got the whole family to travel to the original town, and the men were counted, not the women. So why else would these authors of the gospel describe these eyewitnesses of the resurrection as women? If they were lying about it, they could have just not specified the gender or said that they were men. The only explanation that they were women is that this actually happened, and people actually saw women witnessing Jesus being resurrected. So that's Jesus didn't exist is number one. Number two, Jesus didn't die. Number three, the disciples moved the body. Number four, he was dead the whole time. Number five, eyewitnesses. 6, mass hallucinations. And 7, disciples changed attitude. And finally, number 8, Saul's conversion to Paul. Now this happened around the same time Jesus was resurrected. It was in that 40-day period. And back when Paul was Saul, he was like the most famous Pharisee around, because he was known for killing Christians just for fun, pretty much, and he would get paid for it. So on the road to Damascus, which is a city in Judea, he saw Jesus and heard God's voice, and on that road to Damascus, he was blinded. And once he got to Damascus, there was a prophet there named Ananias, and he restored his sight through putting mud over his face. And after Saul was no longer Saul when he regained his sight, God named him Paul. And Paul was probably the most influential missionary to ever preach the word to Gentiles in all of biblical history. He wrote 12 books, which were letters, 12 books of the Bible, which were letters to various churches. He probably wrote dozens more that weren't mentioned in the Bible. He spread the word to all these Gentiles, which way back then, the Gentiles weren't seen as, they weren't seen as pure. They were seen as unclean, so they weren't, by Jewish law, they weren't allowed to hear Christianity or follow Christianity as the Jews did. And because of Paul, we are now, all of us are Gentiles. Gentiles means not a Jew. And so we were able to hear the message way back then. And during Paul's journeys, he encountered many persecutions. He was beat. He was thrown in jail countless times. He was whipped, flogged. He was tortured, thrown out of temples, thrown out of cities. Everything you can imagine that would happen to a person pretty much happened to Paul. And ultimately he was beheaded for his Christian beliefs. Now, why would he do this and have this sudden change of heart from killing Christians to supporting them if it wasn't true, if he didn't actually believe, if he didn't actually see Jesus? What point would there be to him spreading the word? There would be no point. It just doesn't make any sense. No one in their right mind would do this. No one in their right mind would go out and spread the word about this belief system he persecuted if it was just a lie. The only explanation is he actually saw Jesus on that road to Damascus, and he was actually changed by God in his heart to become a Christian and spread the word. And that's all 8 points. So Jesus did exist. He was a real person. Jesus did in fact die on that cross. And the resurrection did in fact happen. The disciples did not move the body. People actually saw him. And the disciples and Paul's change of heart were 100% legitimate and actually done by God. And those are my 8 reasons. And this just gives everyone in here a foundation of just some simple arguments that people might give you when you're out in the world and spreading your Christian beliefs. Because this world is out to get you. It's not your friend, especially Christians. Everyone hates Christians except for Christians. It's just the facts. Everyone doesn't like us. And in the end, we're the minority, but God will help us stand out against the majority of non-believers in the end.
Amen.